Stop spending a fortune on store-bought beer. Become a home brewer and do it yourself. It's easy. Beer is expensive, especially if you, like my wife and I, prefer craft beer. It's really expensive. So we decided after a long time of spending over $10 for a 6-pack of beer that we needed to just start making it ourselves. So that's exactly what we did. And we do it exclusively. We no longer purchase store-bought beer almost ever. There's a few occasions that we're going to a party or something like that and we'll take some with us, or if I get a little lazy and forget to make a batch and have one ready to go, we'll have to go run to the store to get something to get us through until I can get one ready for us to drink. Getting started in brewing beer is not as expensive or difficult as you might think. It's actually pretty easy. And the end results are you get quality craft beers for around 35 cents a bottle or less than 50 cents for a pint. So whether you like stouts, IPAs, red ales, pilsners, doesn't matter. You can make it yourself. So without further ado, let's get to it. So first off, there's going to be some things that you're going to need, some equipment. You're going to need a fermentation bucket, preferably one with a spigot, also known as a bottling bucket. You will need a lid. You will also need an airlock, a hydrometer with the hydrometer testing tube, a large stock pot, a spoon to stir with, and a beer. And now that we've covered the equipment, you're also going to need a few ingredients. Malt, or in this case, liquid malt extract. More on that later. Hops. And the magic ingredient, brewer's yeast. First, you want to start off by filling a pot with approximately 1.5 gallons or so of water. Once you have your water topped off, we're just going to move it over to the stove and start bringing it to a boil. Now, while we're waiting on our water to do its thing, I'll take this few minutes to talk about malt extract. There's basically 2 different kinds of malt extract. There is liquid malt extract and there is dry malt extract. I personally prefer liquid malt extract because dry malt extract has a tendency to get all over the place and it's pretty sticky like tree sap. What we were doing here is referred to as extract brewing as opposed to all grain brewing, which is a whole nother subject all on its own. It's very involved. It takes a lot more time to do, and since we're just making beer for us to drink all the time and never buying beer and not just doing it as a hobby, this is obviously the way that we like to do things because it's much faster. And if you buy your ingredients in bulk, it's not that terribly expensive as compared to brewing an all grain, which is notoriously cheaper than purchasing malt extract. However, if you want to brew as a hobby, on the other hand, then maybe you can look into doing all grain brewing, but I would still start off with the extract brewing first just to get the whole processes down of keeping everything clean and sanitized and just how all this works to make beer. All grain brewing is great if you're wanting to enter a competition with your beer or you want to sit around and stroke your beard and ponder the small nuances of your malt layering with your hops and blah, blah, blah. We're just making good beer to drink. Okay, now that our water has come to a boil, we are going to turn off the heat and wait for that to settle down just a minute because you never want to add malt extract to already boiling water because you will get a boil over. And now we are going to slowly add the extract into the water, stirring it in as we go. What I'm using here is gold malt extract. Liquid malt extract and dry malt extract come in several different varieties, but the most common are gold, amber, and dark. which are pretty self-explanatory. You're making a pale ale, you're probably going to want to go with gold. If you're making an amber ale, go with the amber malt. If you're making a stout or a porter, go with the dark malt. And since I don't want to sit here and wait on every little bit of that to drain out because it will take a while, what I like to do is to take some of the hot wort that we have now and ladle a few spoonfuls into the container. Squeeze the container before you put on the lid very tightly. If you don't squeeze some of the air out as you start shaking it with the hot water in there, it's going to expand and blow the cap off. I know from personal experience. Shake it up real good. Get all that stuff that's stuck to the sides and to the bottom. You pay good money for it. You don't want to waste it. And then add that right in. Now we're going to turn back on the heat and bring this back up to a low simmer. Libations. It's hard work. And now we wait. Oh. All right, and as you can see, the wort has now come back up to a boil, and we're going to add our first addition of hops. This is Cascade hops, 1 ounce. A little bit about hop additions. You typically boil your wort for 1 hour. The hops that you put in at the very beginning that get the full hour is what is going to give you your bitterness. The hops that you add towards the end, that's what's going to give you some more of the aroma and hop flavor. There's basically 3 different kinds of hops. There's bittering hops, aroma hops, and dual purpose hops, which means they can be used for bittering the beer or for aroma and taste. Cascade hops do both equally well. This is pretty much just going to be a pale ale, not very bitter, because Cascade hops typically aren't very bitter. Hops have something called a alpha acid value, and it's measured in a percentage. The higher the value, the more bittering potential that the hops have. The lower the value, not so much. You can research about hops on the internet and I'm sure learn more about it than I could ever teach in this video. This is just the basics. All right, now we're gonna continue to let that boil. We'll come back and stir it every once in a while, and for the most part, we're done with that until we're gonna add the next hop addition towards the end of the boil, which will be another ounce of Cascade hops for aroma and flavor. Now, while that continues to brew away, I'm gonna go ahead and start my yeast. I just have a bowl here with a little bit of water in it, and I'm gonna pour the yeast right on top. This is just a really cheap, easy to find brewer's yeast, an ale yeast. A lot of extract brewing recipes call for just dumping the dry yeast directly onto the beer when it's in the fermentation bucket and cooled down. I prefer to start it in a bowl like this, just as a little bit of added insurance that, who knows, the yeast may have gone bad and I just added a whole pack to it and it's never gonna do anything, and then I have to add more yeast. This way I give it a nice head start and I can see that it's good stuff. After the yeast has been sitting for several minutes, I like to take a big spoon and just kind of pick it up and drop it into itself. It helps mix everything up and it also helps to aerate it. Yeast like air too. And I'll just do this for about 15-20 times. Mesmerizing. Okay, our wort's been brewing for about 45 minutes, which means there's about 15 minutes left, and it's time to add the last hop addition, which is another ounce of Cascade hops, and this is what's going to give us a little bit of aroma and hop flavor to the beer. We'll just stir that in. And proceed to the next step. Now this is something that most home brewers would say is a big no-no. This is 1 cup of just plain old table sugar. Ideally, you're supposed to use dry malt extract to add to the wort, and the only purpose of doing either one of these things is just to bump up the potential alcohol content a little bit so that it's not so weak. We're not looking to make near beer here. I've found that adding just half a cup of table sugar, or I'm sorry, 1 cup of table sugar really doesn't put off any off flavors or anything weird. You don't want to go crazy with it and add in 3 pounds of table sugar. Then you might actually get something a little strange because it'll be less beer and more of just fermented sugar water. But I know what anyone that brews is going to say. Oh, you can't add table sugar to that. Oh, doing it. Did it. Stirring it in. All right, there's only about 10 minutes left in the boil, and what we have here is a wort chiller. You submerge this into the beer, and one end hooks to your faucet. Cold water comes in one side, hot water comes out the other side and cools the beer. The idea is you want to get your beer cooled down from the boil as fast as possible, because as it's boiling, it's kind of immune to anything that might contaminate it. Once it cools down, it's vulnerable to any nasty baddies that might just be floating around in the air and getting your beer and ruin it. We're putting this in with 10 minutes left in the boil because we want it to be submersed in the boiling wort for a little while to get rid of anything that might have contaminated the wort chiller itself, and whatever may have been on there will surely be dead after it boils a good 10 minutes. And don't continue touching it like that after you put it in. It's really hot. Ow. All right, it's been about 10 minutes, so now it's time to turn on the cold water on the faucet and start letting it circulate through the wort chiller. And then you'll see in just a matter of seconds, the boil will stop. And that's pretty much it. It starts working that fast. If you do not have a wort chiller or just decide that you don't want to spend the money on one, there is alternative methods to cool the wort down as quickly as possible. Probably the easiest would be to fill your sink with ice and then just take the entire pot and stick it in the ice and maybe twist it around a few times every now and then, and it will get it cool. It'll take a little while, but just get a wort chiller. They're not that expensive, and this has gone from boiling and it'll be down to less than 100 degrees in just under 20 minutes. My groundwater right now is probably about 55 degrees. In the dead of winter, it cools down real fast. Okay, the wort has been chilled down and the wort chiller has been taken out. I've got the temperature of the wort down to around 85 degrees or so. The temperature of the water is around 65. I already have it filled up to around 3.5 gallons because I have about 1.5 gallons here, and we're making a 5-gallon batch. It's easy to tell how much water you have in the bucket because it has graduated lines going down the side of it right here. So now we're ready to pour the wort into the bucket. We're gonna stop just short, about right there, so we're not just putting in all of that hop residue that's down in the bottom into the bucket. There's no need for that. I can see that I'm just a little short of where I need to be at around the 5-gallon mark. Ideally a little bit over 5 gallons, because when you bottle or keg, the spout is slightly above the bottom of the bucket, and that's so it will leave any sediment and things like that behind in the bottom. So you want to have a little over 5 gallons to start with if you want to end up with 5 gallons at the end. And that looks about right. Now we're going to take our cleaned mixing spoon again and just give this a bit of a stir. And that looks pretty good. We have our lid. We're going to put that on. Ideally with your wort temperature, just to talk about that just for 1 second, you don't want to pitch yeast into wort that is too hot. If it's 85, 90 degrees, you're liable just to shock and kill the yeast. They don't like that. If it's too cold, they might just end up going dormant and not really doing much of anything at all. You want it to be somewhere between like 68 and 75 at the most. That's your ideal pitching temperatures. And it's a good idea just to know where you are with your temperature, to have just like a little instant read thermometer on hand, just so you actually know and you're not guessing. Okay, for the next part of the process, we are going to take the original gravity reading. More on about what that means in just a minute. When you take your hydrometer and put it into your wort, it will float at different heights dependent on how many dissolved solids there are in the liquid, meaning the sugar. The yeast will start to eat the sugar until they've had all they can, and at the end of your fermenting process, you're going to take another gravity reading once the fermenting is stopped, and it's going to be lower than your original because the dissolved solids or the sugars have been consumed and then converted into alcohol. There are online calculators where you can enter in your starting gravity reading and then your final gravity reading, and it will give you your alcohol by volume. I'll leave a link in the description below to one of those calculators. Also leave a link to a site that will explain in a lot further detail than I just did exactly how a hydrometer works and how to read one. Basically, you put the hydrometer into the test tube and give it a little spin, so any bubbles that are stuck to it will come off. And when it stops, you can read your reading. And this appears to be 1.040. This beer will end up being somewhere between 3.9 and 4.4%, just depending on how well it ferments. And now it's time to pitch the yeast. We'll remove the lid. We'll dump our yeast in. I'll give this just a little rinse to make sure I get all of it out. Like so. Now we're just going to give that a little bit of a stir. And now we're ready to put our lid back on and make sure it's really on good and sealed all the way around. And next, we're going to introduce our airlock. The airlock, you fill to the little marks here with water. As the beer ferments, it creates CO2. That's going to come up through here and out the top and bubble out. The idea is the CO2 is able to escape out of here, but nothing can get in. And now we just put this in a cool place, not a hot room or a really cold room, just about around room temperature, about 72 degrees. And then we wait for 4 to 7 days. Just a quick footnote on cleanliness. All the equipment you want to clean with like an oxygen type cleanser, like OxyClean, or go with an off-brand, of course, because it's going to be cheaper. You want to get something it's not scented. There's no reason why your beer needs to smell like spring rain or an ocean breeze, for instance. Once everything's been cleansed, you want to use a good quality sanitizer like Star San. The initial cost it's not very cheap, but 1 ounce of this stuff will make 5 gallons of sanitizer. Very important to have everything clean and sanitized that's coming in contact with your beer just to avoid it being contaminated, because if it gets something in there that infects the beer, it will not be anything like what you expected. It's going to taste pretty bad. So with that, we just got to wait for this to start fermenting. Well, that about does it for me and this video. If you enjoyed it, make sure you click the old thumbs up. Don't forget to subscribe. And until next time, do it right, do it well, do it yourself.